Welcome back. Now, with the tough balancing act awaiting Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana this week, fiscal relief can be brought by tapping into the Reserve Bank gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account, but with rules. This according to Absa. The organization's senior economist, Peter Worthington, joins us with more insight. Peter, a pleasure and a good afternoon to you.
Good afternoon. Thanks.
All right, Peter, I'm first keen to start off by maybe getting your thoughts on the kinds of revenue and gaps that the Finance Minister would have to contend with on Wednesday.
So I think the first point is that our fiscal pressures aren't just in this year. We've been accumulating them for many years, and I think they're reflected in the fact that we have really now quite a sizable debt burden with a fairly hefty sort of real interest rate on that debt burden. But if we're thinking just about the budget upcoming, we're thinking about a deficit perhaps for this year of 330 billion rand or so. And we have the Trafecra surplus balance, which is sitting at about 500 billion rand, that is legally an asset of treasuries. But of course, when you actually contemplate the issue, it's sort of more complicated than that. And there's no way Treasury can or should use all of that surplus in one fell go. So I think that there's going to be a lot of debate between SARB and Treasury about what can be safely and prudently utilized in a way that doesn't cause problems for monetary policy or the broader macroeconomic balances.
So let's talk about this gold and foreign exchange contingency reserve account, Pete. Already, the public conversation has been very polarizing with some schools of thought that we should never even look in that direction. But of course, desperate times may call for, desperate solutions.
Yes, there have been quite a few views out there. I think understanding of just exactly what the Trafecra is and what standard practices are for central banks around the world in dealing with foreign exchange revaluation gains or losses, there's not sort of terribly good understanding. I think people who are opposed to it, I have two concerns. One is that it will just appear like this magical pot of money enabling the government to boost spending, when actually our fundamental fiscal issues relate to the fact that we've been spending too much in relation to the tax collections that we've been able to gather. And the second concern that people have who are opposed to it is that if it's not done in the right way, it can cause real problems for the central bank in terms of their profitability, in terms of their ability to implement monetary policy, and so on. So those are the opponents. But the proponents say, listen, in general, this is a sum of money and we've got a big debt problem. It is actually part of the public sector sort of balance sheet anyway. And we should be utilizing everything that we can to try and curb longer dated borrowing at fairly expensive interest rates. So the proponents, I think, also could be aware of the fact that around the world, many other central banks sort of have these FX revaluation gains and losses. In general, they tend to book them into their P&Ls. But ultimately, they do make profit distributions to governments. So to the extent that they made gains over a long period of time, those would flow back to the national treasuries in these other countries. So I'm not surprised there's a diversity of views. But I think, as you just indicated, we're in a pretty difficult fiscal situation. Utilizing the Trafecra is not on its own going to solve our fiscal problems, but it can help at the margins if we do it prudently.
Peter, a big part of this is that it isn't hardcore cash. It is, cash in kind or reserves. How we then realize that, making it something tangible that can be used for whatever national needs we may move that to?
I think so, but listen, it has to be funded somehow from SARB, and there are really only two ways to do that. One, you sell assets, foreign exchange reserves, and maybe we've got about 35 billion government bonds sitting on the Reserve Bank's balance sheet on the asset side. those things could be sold to finance it, but I think that that's not optimal, and it's certainly not something that the SARB would want to do, because it already has, by sort of international standards, a fairly small balance sheet in relation to the size of GDP, and it's generally thought that central banks should have reasonably sized, sufficient balance sheet size to be able to cope with shocks into the future. So the other way to do it would be to simply monetize it by making a deposit into National Treasury's tax and loan accounts. And after that SARB makes that deposit, which is essentially printing money, presumably Treasury will draw down on that balance. Now, the problem is once you've made that deposit, it's a liquidity injection into the financial system. And that poses some challenges for a central bank which is trying to peg interest rates to a certain level to control inflation. For an inflation targeting a central bank, depending on the size of the transfer, it could be a really significant liquidity injection. They have tools to sterilize that, but all of those tools come with a cost, because at the moment, the JFECRA balance sits on the liability side of the SARB's balance sheet, and it's not interest-bearing. There's no cost to the SARB to be owing this money to government because it's not paying interest on it. But if they were to go through that process of monetizing a transfer, and they have a liquidity sort of surge that they then have to sterilize, the cost of sterilizing it would be the repo rate. And for a pretty significant, let's say a transfer of 100 billion rand, you would, if the SARB was going to sterilize all of that, the cost of that per annum would be around a little over 8 billion rand. And that is 4 times as much as the SARB's profit in the last fiscal year. So you can see how, we could have pretty significant sterilization costs that would cause problems for the SARB's profitability and financial position over the long run. But listen, there are many ways that this can actually play out. We might find a much more gradual tap of JFECRA, which sort of creates more manageable sterilization costs, or it's possible that a more manageable tap of the JFECRA, the SARB might determine that that didn't really need to be sterilized. We're going to have to see, firstly, I think, what the Finance Minister has to say on Wednesday about utilizing the JFECRA. And once we sort of can see that, we can have a better idea of what the SARB's options are.
Well, Peter, we look forward to engagement post-Wednesday to see how this could all play out. I'd like to thank you for your time this afternoon. That was Peter Worthington. He's a senior economist at Absa.